So I want to first, thank everyone for coming to this International Cultural Studies Certificate Program speakers series talk featuring Dr. Sean Smith. I'm Ruth Hsu, the co-director, along with Dr. Nandita Sharma of ICS. So we stepped in rather late in the day, and we'll be co-directors for this academic year. So let me do the honors first. What I propose that I do is I give a very brief introduction to Sean, whom I think most of you know, probably much better than I know. And then I'll explain briefly how the Q&A period will go. After Sean concludes his talk, I'll go over the Q&A again, perhaps with a bit more details. Okay, so first I want to thank Dr. Sean Smith for agreeing to come and speak at ICS Speakers Series for the fall of 2020. So as most of you know, Dr. Smith is in the philosophy department here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His most recent publication with Evan Thompson is titled Searching for Affect, from William James to Neurophenomenology, published in Psychology of Consciousness. He's got several chapters, articles in circulation. He's also won numerous awards, and I'm just going to read a few of those from the University of Toronto Philosophy Fund Award in 2017, also Julia Ching Memorial Prize, and University of Toronto Doctoral Completion Award, and those are just, some of the top few awards that Sean has won. Okay, so the Q&A, there are two ways to go about this. I want to preface this by saying that I don't curate the questions or the comments. Once the floor is open to the participants, please feel free to speak to Sean or to write to Sean and carry on a conversation with Sean. Okay, so there are two ways to do this. One is by writing your comment or question in the Q&A box. So at the bottom of all of your screens, you'll see an icon that simply says Q&A. So you can click on that box and type in your question. You have the option of doing it with your name or anonymously. Then what I usually do is read off the comments or the questions as they are queued up. So I don't, curate or select this first or that first or anything like that. And sometimes the featured speaker, they like to do that as well. So an alternative is for you to actually speak your comment or your question. Sean, of course, in both ways will be able to, will speak his response. For the spoken version, in all of your in all of your screens, you have the raise hand function. If you could raise your hand, I will call your name and then ask you to unmute yourself, or I can unmute, or Sean actually has the capability, the tool to unmute you so that you can speak your comment or your question. And the raise hand function is so that we don't miss anybody, so that everybody can be queued up, and we'll just go down the queue. So I'll repeat these instructions after Sean is done. Sean, please take it away.
Hey.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I know you're many of you are distributed across the earth in different ways. This is maybe the one good thing that comes from living under these absurd conditions. So this is the first research talk I've given since the pandemic hit. I'll do my best. So I'm going to get right into it. I'm very grateful to be here. The content of this discussion is actually a little bit outside of what I've normally been publishing in. Ruth, I will note one thing. The publication you mentioned was my very first publication, not my most recent. The most recent publication is, I have a forthcoming article in Philosopher's Imprint coming out on the nature of not self-thinking in Indian Buddhist philosophy, and another forthcoming article in Contemporary Pragmatism about the epistemic role of consciousness in William James's Principles of Psychology. But anyways, neither here nor there. The really interesting thing for me is I wanted to give a talk for this group ever since I arrived at UH Mānoa, precisely because of its focus on cultural studies and cultural criticism, which is something I have a deep interest in, but have not had the opportunity to really work as seriously on since taking up my job here. So I'm really happy to be able to present these ideas, which I've kind of been tinkering with in the background on the proverbial back burner for a number of years, in fact. So the title of my talk is The Rhetoric of Science and the Construction of Buddhist Modernism. And what I'm going to try and do in this talk is trace a kind of dialectic that I'm seeing in contemporary discourse between Buddhism and science. And on the one side, we have this common trope of Buddhist modernism, which claims that Buddhism isn't a religion, but it's rather a life path or a mind science. I'm in the habit of having to teach a 300-level course on Buddhist philosophy about every year, and it doesn't fail that in every time I teach that class, in the opening day, when I ask people what they know about Buddhism, what they think about it, someone will say this. They will say that precise line. They're like, well, it's not really a religion. It's more like a path or a philosophy or a science of minds. This is a very common image that people have of Buddhism, and that indeed, as I will claim, Buddhism has of itself in some spheres. Now, the response to this image by many anthropologically and philologically inclined Buddhologists has been to be very critical of this self-construal by pointing out that Buddhism is a historical phenomena and that we can only really properly understand it in its local cultural context. So my goal in this talk is to try and think constructively about how we can mediate this dispute by using the internal philosophical resources of Buddhism. Buddhist hermeneutical philosophy is remarkably self-aware and rigorous. And so what I hope to do is utilize some of these philosophical resources to think about how we can understand Buddhism and its conversation with science without lapsing into a problematic, transparent claim that Buddhism just is a science of some kind, and also avoiding what for me is a pitfall of being too culturally relative about Buddhism, especially as we push back against the sort of mind science conception of it. So that's generally what I'm going to be up to. The talk will have three parts. In the first part, I'm going to just do some exegetical work. I'm going to define for you an interdisciplinary milieu called contemplative science, talk about some of its constituents and some of its attendant problems. Then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to go into a bit of detail about this dispute, this dialectic between the mind science image of Buddhism and the culturally specific narrative around the nature of Buddhism. And then in the third part of the talk, I'm going to articulate a tripartite philosophical solution to the problem of mediating between science and culture in explaining and integrating Buddhism into modernity. So that's the talk. So the first part, what is contemplative science? Well, a very brief answer is that it is an attempt to bring contemplative methodologies, by which I mean practices internal to various world religions. Buddhism is only one example. Meditation is sort of the word that we tend to use for these practices, into contact with methods of scientific inquiry, in particular psychology and neuroscience. This is a huge budding field now. Why should we do this? Well, at the heart of both endeavors, the endeavor of contemplative practice as it's situated in various world religions, our main object here will be Buddhism on the one hand, and modern science on the other. Embedded in both projects is an attempt to understand the nature of experience, to map the mind. So there's a descriptive project that both disciplines share. And there's a normative project there as well, namely the attempt to pursue an answer to the question of how to live a better life, how to flourish as a human being. So I think this amount of overlap between the two disciplines makes them natural conversation partners. So I'm not going to be expressing any skepticism about the viability of this project, but simply trying to understand some of the philosophical problems that emerge from it. So another way of defining contemplative science is to dissect the whole into its constituent parts. From the perspective of academic research, we can understand the constitution of contemplative science as an interdisciplinary research program in terms of at least four different components. There may be others, but these are the four that I'll focus on for today. The first is what I'll call contemplative phenomenology. That is the kind of expertise had by actual practitioners of contemplative practices like mindfulness. These individuals are often monastics, committed members of various religious orders. For all kinds of interesting historical reasons, this conversation has been predominantly dominated by Buddhists. These are the people who have spent tens of thousands of hours practicing these practices. So they are, in that sense, experts in the kind of attentional cultivation that tends to typify what we will call contemplative practice. Second is religious studies. These are the scholars who study contemplative traditions from a textual and anthropologically local point of view, or at least they tend to. So these are the folks who, really get inside the languages, really get inside the textual traditions, and the local cultural manifestation of those traditions as they are lived on the ground by the people who bring these traditions to life. And we have the sciences, in particular the neuroscientists and psychologists who study the brain and behavior of that undergird these practices. And then finally, philosophy. And I will here perhaps narrowly define philosophy in terms of those scholars who work on the arguments of these traditions, the practice of rational reconstruction of the truth claims embedded in these traditions. And all four of these disciplines sort of work together in different ways to constitute the fabric of contemplative science. Now, I mentioned just now that Buddhism has tended to be the central tradition that brings forth the contemplative practices into the milieu of contemplative science. Well, why is that? There's a number of reasons for it. Some good, some not good. Here's a nice mixed summary of that from Evan Thompson's recent book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. He says that there is a popular idea that Buddhism is inherently rational and scientific. People say that Buddhism isn't so much a religion as it is a philosophy or way of life. It dispenses with the concept of God, upholds direct observation, understands things in terms of cause and effect, maintains that everything constantly changes, and says that there is no essential self or soul. Because that image is very alive in a widespread understanding of what Buddhism is, that makes it a very natural partner for a discussion with empirical science. Now, we can poke some holes in this image if we would like. For example, it's true that Buddhism does dispense with the concept of God in the following specific sense. Buddhism claims that the solution to the soteriological problem that it is designed to solve makes no recourse to a God. But Buddhist philosophy is embedded in a radically extended cosmology, which it inherits from its Hindu counterpart. So Buddhism is atheistic in a very narrow sense of the term, where the significance is there are gods in the Buddhist worldview. Brahma exists. It's just that Brahma can't help you get to nirvana very much. Okay. So it's true also that Buddhism understands things in terms of cause and effect, just like empirical science. At the same time, Buddhist conceptions of cause and effect are robustly normative. That is, they are embedded in a commitment to the existence of karma. The idea that the causes and effects that animate the natural world extend beyond the boundaries of your present life and are normatively encoded. Namely, if you are greedy in this life, there's a good chance you're going to come back as a nut-starved squirrel in the next. That is a causal relationship for Buddhists, but perhaps one that empirical scientists might be somewhat hesitant to endorse. So what I'm trying to point out here is that there is an image of Buddhism as scientific, and that image is selective. That is not to say that it isn't inaccurate. 2 points I want to make here right away before I continue is that I do think that Buddhism is a fantastic partner for this discussion, but we need to be very careful about why we think that. First and foremost, Buddhism does represent, among other things, a very sophisticated philosophical psychology. In particular, the multifarious Abhidharmic tradition represents really one of the most fine-grained attempts to map human states of consciousness that's ever been attempted by human minds. That on its own, I think, is a reason to take this tradition seriously as an active partner in the project of understanding the nature of the mind. Buddhism also boasts a whole suite of rigorous contemplative practices. But that's true of almost all religions. Most world religions have a contemplative branch. Okay? Buddhism isn't special in this regard. Now, this image of Buddhism as a kind of scientific, rational religion is a component of a larger phenomena that Buddhist scholars call Buddhist Modernism. And Buddhist Modernism is what we'll call the modern transnational form of Buddhism that downplays the metaphysical, for example, doctrines of karma and rebirth, and ritual elements of traditional Asian Buddhism, while emphasizing personal meditative experience and scientific rationality. That's exactly right. I want to add to that point one historical note that's really important for us. This mode of framing Buddhism, this dimension of Buddhist modernism that sees Buddhism as a kind of scientific rational religion is not just the fevered projection of Western psychoanalysts, okay? It is absolutely internal to the way Buddhist cultures have attempted to modernize themselves and defend themselves against colonial oppression. So there are 2 examples here that I think are extremely relevant to us. First, in Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Burma, Buddhists of the Theravada tradition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were very concerned to articulate a psychologically realistic and rational conception of Buddhism in order to combat the influence of Christian missionaries. And so the image of Buddhism as scientific and rational arises internal to Buddhist cultures attempting to defend their own borders against colonial influence. The Dalai Lama's mission to make Buddhism scientific in the wake of China's annexing of Tibet is also incredibly relevant here. This was a very self-conscious political move designed to bring in support and to gain influence for Tibetan culture and religion, to find allies in exile, okay? And that doesn't make the image that is constructed for these motivations any less useful or true. It's just an important genealogical point so that we can be aware of the origins of this discourse and why it's relevant right now, okay? Now, here are some problems that we might have with Buddhist modernism as a whole. This passage is from a very important book written by a friend and colleague of mine, David McMahon. He wrote a book called The Making of Buddhist Modernism. It is a masterpiece of contemporary scholarship, and I recommend it to everyone. He claims that this popular Western picture of Buddhism that we've been talking about just now is neither unambiguously there in ancient Buddhist texts and lived traditions, nor merely a fantasy of an educated elite population in the West, an image with no corresponding object. It is rather an actual new form of Buddhism. So the problem of Buddhist modernism arises when it presents itself as if it were the original essential core of Buddhism, where the fact that it is historically recent, where the fact that it is an active, selective reconstruction of certain elements of Buddhist doctrine and practice becomes obscured, that the authenticating influence of objective science functions as a lens through which we selectively choose those elements of Buddhism that we like and then claim that those are the really real essential parts. And then we ignore all of the other parts. My favorite example of this is the idea that Buddhism is a mind science. The Dalai Lama is very fond of claiming this. But he also has advisors who talk to demons to get political advice. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's a piece of the tapestry, right? It's a relevant piece of the tapestry. And all of it together collectively constitutes what we would call Tibetan Buddhism. So the point here about the problem of Buddhist modernism is that it is selectively attending to certain elements of Buddhism and its history in an unself-conscious way, whereby those elements that come in for preferential analysis are then forwarded as the essential core of the system. So that's Buddhist modernism. Now I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk and try and diagnose and analyze this dispute I see between scientific conceptions of Buddhism and what I'll call culturally relativistic conceptions of Buddhism. So here are two questions that I'm going to try and address in this section. The first one in particular in this section, I won't be able to answer. The second one until I conclude the talk. But here's the first question. It goes back to one of my earlier slides. How can we carry out genuinely interdisciplinary research, like in contemplative science, when the subdisciplines that constitute it have radically different explanatory norms? The most obvious example of this is the way in which explanatory norms in religious studies differ from explanatory norms in empirical science. Empirical science operates under a pretension of objectivity. The kinds of analysis that we see populating religious studies discourse are very much about the local, the specific, the historical. So how do we do genuine interdisciplinary research when the constituents of that interdisciplinary milieu are operating under divergent explanatory norms? That's the first question. The second question is, how can we integrate insights of cultural criticism, which I'll explain as we proceed, philosophically into our understanding of the evolving conversation between Buddhism and modern science? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline a criticism that comes back from the culturally specific side of this scholarly tapestry, and against the mind science conception. And then I'm going to think, okay, how can we integrate those critical insights, those criticisms philosophically, while continuing to push forward the dialogue between Buddhism and science? The preliminary answer I have to both of these questions is by taking Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist hermeneutics much more seriously in framing Buddhism's contribution to this dialogue. Buddhism does not simply provide us with meditation. Buddhism's contribution to this dialogue is rigorously philosophical. Okay? So my first attempt to integrate some insights from Buddhist philosophical psychology to the hermeneutics of the interdisciplinary research paradigm is to point you to this very interesting little piece of Buddhist moral psychology called the Four Divine Abodes, or Brahma Viharas. This is a piece of moral psychology that is embraced by many different Buddhist schools and refers to this idea that these are some states that you need to cultivate. These are pro-social, empathetic attitudes that will help your life go well. All right. Loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. We want to cultivate these states in very huge quantities. Okay. That's the basic thesis. Now, the reason I'm talking to you about this is because in his magnum opus, the Visudimaga, the 5th century scholar monk Buddhaghosa provides us with an extremely nuanced analysis of how these pro-social empathetic states are developed and how they go wrong. And it is the framework that he is using to provide that analysis that I think could be helpful to us. Let me explain what I mean. Buddhaghosa distinguishes between what he calls the remote and near enemies of the Brahmaviharas. The remote enemy is a kind of psychological opposite that each pro-social state is designed to eliminate. So, for example, we cultivate loving kindness to overcome and eliminate hatred or ill will. We cultivate sympathetic joy, joy in the accomplishments of others, in order to overcome envy. But Buddhaghosa also says that each of these states, each of these divine abodes, has a near enemy. And the near enemy is a kind of internal disposition that the positive, wholesome, pro-social state has to self-corrupt. It's a kind of, if you're not careful, it can go wrong. My favorite example of this is the near enemy of sympathetic joy. So think about a parent who's really proud of their kid because the kid has been forced to vicariously realize all of the parents' failed dreams. So little Tommy is playing hockey because dad never made it to the NHL. And Tommy's really good at hockey. He's better at hockey than dad ever was, okay? And because of that, dad is very proud of Tommy. But why? Because there's a very strong attachment where that's my son. And what and the child's accomplishments are a reflection on the parent. So there's a kind of attachment there. But you can see that there is still joy in the child's accomplishments. So the corruption of that state is internal to its essence, rather than being overcome by something that is psychologically opposite to it. All right? So my idea here is that this distinction between remote and near enemies is a very sophisticated hermeneutical device for diagnosing some of the interdisciplinary worries that I've been trying to articulate for you today. So, for example, when we think about contemplative phenomenology as a discipline, one of the remote enemy of contemplative phenomenology is scholasticism. And this is actually this is a verifiable piece of history in many different places in Buddhist cultures, where there's a kind of revolution in the monastic order where we go back to meditating in order to push back against the dry scholastic recitation of texts. This happened in early 20th century Burma. The philosophical motivations behind the emergence of Yogacara Buddhism are very much about a return to the practice of yoga. The rhetoric of Zen Buddhism is very much about a return to the basic practices of seeing through things rather than texts. Now, of course, all these traditions have deep textual, strata in them. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is the remote enemy of contemplative phenomenology. Scholasticism, as I'm calling it, is a deep part of the history of Buddhism. Now, the near enemy of contemplative phenomenology is what I'll call dogmatism. What I mean by this is the following. I don't know if any of you have been, run in circles where people are really hardcore meditators, but you've never met some people who are more confident that they are mainlining the secret truth of the universe. People who get really deep into meditation tend to develop a very profound confidence that they have understood the secret laws of the universe. That's dangerous from a scholarly point of view. I never want to have that kind of confidence, even if even when I'm meditating. So there's a near enemy there, right? The closer and deeper you go into your experience, the more confident you get that what you've really found is the really real thing. This is why religious studies is so helpful, because religious studies, as it approaches, especially the tradition of Buddhism, is well armed against essentialism of various sorts. They really know how to deconstruct and historicize and contextualize reified understandings of traditions. And that's why religious studies participation in the interdisciplinary milieu of contemplative science is so essential. But the problem that arises with religious studies analyses is what I'll call a kind of anthropologically reductive, or even in some cases culturally relativistic attitude towards the phenomena being studied, which is its own problem that I will talk to you about in a few minutes. I'm not going to go through science and philosophy right now because I'm mindful of the time. But if anyone wants to come back to this in the question period and we can talk a bit more about it, I'll be happy to do so. So here's the dialectic that I'm concerned with. When we start to look at contemplative phenomenology seriously through a scholarly lens, when we do so through the lens of psychology and neuroscience, there's a trend towards what I'm going to call Buddhist neuroapologetics. And I'm going to diagnose and dismantle that view in a moment. Then on the other side, when we start to become historically local and culturally and contextually sensitive to the emergence of these practices, we can very quickly lapse into a kind of cultural relativism. And that's also a problem. So I'm going to try and offer a philosophical way out of this conundrum. Okay, that's my goal in the rest of my talk here today. All right. So one thing that we need to keep in mind here is that there are actually different ways of understanding the significance of contemplative phenomenology from both an internal practitioner's perspective and also from a scholarly perspective in terms of situating contemplative practices in their traditional milieus and studying them, either scientifically or otherwise. The first conception of the significance of contemplative phenomenology is this idea that what contemplative phenomenology is there to do is to help us see things as they are. The Pali term for this is yatha bhutang, as it is, that we're going to learn to see things as they really are in themselves. So what do? We develop this awareness, this cultivated, focused, peaceful awareness. This gives us experiential access to stratums of mental functioning that we would otherwise remain ignorant of, and this gives us insight into the ultimate truth or fundamental nature of reality. That's one conception. Very prominent conception, internal to the way Buddhism has understood itself. Here's another conception that's also important. It's what I call baking in a social imaginary. What's a social imaginary? Here's a quote from a more recent paper from Dave McMahon. A social imaginary is constituted by a repertoire of concepts, attitudes, social practices, customs, ethical dispositions, institutions, power relations, and structures of authority. It determines what is normative, what is taken for granted, what goes without saying. On this conception of the significance of contemplative phenomenology for the traditions in which it's situated, these many different detailed maps of the path, and in Buddhism there are many different detailed maps, the yanas, lamrim, bhavana kama, so on, are in this view best seen as constructive models that do not simply represent a certain territory, but configure it according to a particular understanding of the Dharma. So we have these two images. And I want us to keep those images in the background as we proceed, because they're very important for diagnosing some of the ways that things get off the rails in terms of this back and forth that we see between the scientific model of Buddhism and the more culturally specific model of it, okay? So now we're going to talk about Buddhist neuroapologetics. Here's John Kabat-Zinn. Buddhism is fundamentally about being in touch with your own deepest nature and letting it flow out of you unimpeded. Whenever I read this, I go, really? That's what it's about. Interesting. I didn't know that. This fundamentality is then explicated in terms of the method of mindfulness, where mindfulness means, very famous quote here, paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So there's some fundamental nature, some deep unearthed truth about us. The practice of mindfulness puts us in touch with that fundamental truth and allows us to simply live in it. And that's the practice. Fantastic. Then what we do is we try to figure out what brain centers are associated with the practice and the brain centers associated with those things that the practice is meant to correct for. So the main operationalized dichotomy here is the dichotomy between being on task and mindful and off-task and mind-wandering. And in some recent research, it's been suggested that there's actually a neural correlate for this, right? That if you look in the posterior cingulate cortex of the default mode network is a key region that's associated with off-task processing, which leads to the question, is the posterior cingulate cortex then a logical target for mindfulness training? This is from a scientific article published in 2013 by a colleague of mine. Okay. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on is we go from having an essentialistic conception of what Buddhism is all about, operationalizing the method, and then neurologizing the targets of the method. Okay, so that's what's happening right now. You can see how this would lead to like a strong degree of confidence. Imagine if you had like very deep personal experience and the authority of science combined in you. That is, I never want to be that confident. So this is one branch of the dialectic, okay? Now, what's the pushback? Where does the criticism come in? Well, the first response from cultural criticism is to note, look, there are a plurality of social imaginaries that constitute Buddhism. In fact, Buddhism is plural. There is no one Dharma. There are just a bunch of culturally situated Buddhisms, and they are all very different from each other. So here's a really lovely quote from Lawrence Kermeyer, a psychiatrist who's been deeply involved in this work for a number of years. He says, far from being neutral or non-judgmental, he's talking about mindfulness now, meditation instructions actually usually include models of the mind that map the expected experiences and provide ways of interpreting their larger ethical and metaphysical significance. The idea that we can get beyond culture ignores the extent to which we need to be encultured in both bodily and discursive ways to have our most complex thoughts and feelings. So the objection here seems to be, look, if you neurologize the targets of mindfulness, what you're doing is erasing the very cultural conditions that enable you to even ask the question in the first place. And that's a kind of methodological blindness you can't afford if you want your account to be rigorous. So far, so good. Now, here's a problem with cultural context. Think about the following sentence. I've heard this sentence uttered in many conference rooms. Everything is contextual. Everything is contextual. So you have to always remember cultural context when we're analyzing any phenomenon. Right, so everything is contextual, except that sentence. That sentence is not contextual, is it? That's what everything means. Everything means precisely regardless of context. So there's a kind of self-defeat when you get too intoxicated with cultural context as a framework for understanding and analyzing the nature of a given phenomena that you're trying to understand. The point here being context of any sort, cultural or otherwise, is the background against which a foregrounded phenomena is rendered intelligible. And we should always be mindful of it, but that does not mean that it is the stopping point for analysis. It is merely another piece of the puzzle that the neurological conception of Buddhism, that Buddhist neuroapologetics is often in the habit of forgetting. So we have to be careful that our advertence to cultural contexts as a pushback against Buddhist neuroapologetics does not enter into a problematic space of self-refutation. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my own proposed solution. It has three parts. One is to talk a little bit about the 4E cognition paradigm in cognitive science, which has been the kind of philosophical backbone against which this dialogue between Buddhism and science first began. I'm going to be brief about this part because a lot of people, including my mentor, have written books and spent a lot of time talking about this. And it's actually the least interesting part of the solution from my perspective. So I'm going to be brief about this part because it's been well worn by others. The second part is I'm going to help myself to a Kantian distinction. We're going to go all the way back to late 18th century Germany and look at a very important distinction in Kant's theoretical philosophy between regulative and constitutive ideals. And then finally, we're going to return to Buddhist philosophical hermeneutics and look at a very important argument from the Madhyamaka tradition called the neither one nor many argument. And I'm going to combine these three things into a philosophical hermeneutical lens that I think will help us in diagnosing and overcoming some of the problems I've been articulating up until now. So here's 4E cognition in a nutshell. 4E cognition claims that all mental states, pick one, belief, perception, memory, that our cognitive life, our mental life is realized because it's embodied, it's embedded in a social context, it is extended beyond the material boundaries of the physical body, and it is enactive, it is participatory. Now, this model has been very influential in cognitive science, but it is a minority view. It is a minority view, especially in the philosophy of mind. There aren't a lot of inactivists around. It's coming up, but it's a respectable minority view. Why it helps is that it really puts the lie to the neurological conception of mindfulness, because it forces us to recognize that the practice of mindfulness goes well beyond some internal self-monitoring. Okay. You can see here that I've tried to use the remote and far enemies rubric to explain some of the advantages and pitfalls of this paradigm. I'm going to only talk about one of the problems, namely what I call uninformative holism. But if anyone wants to talk about the philosophical nuts and bolts of this, happy to address that in the question period. But I'm mindful of the time, and I want to make sure that there's plenty of opportunity for discussion and question. So I'm going to be a little bit quick during this particular aspect of it. So here's my beef with 4E cognition, okay? 4E cognition is in the business of generating very holistic modes of explanation that cut across brain, body, and world boundaries. And that's really good when we want to analyze certain concepts like mindfulness. But it comes with a cost of what I'll call fineness of grain. Here's why. If you claim that an entire culture is the supervenience base for an individual's mental life, then it becomes super unclear how we could even go about individuating mental states. So with the expansion of our theoretical lens outside of the skull, into the body's environment, we run the risk, unless we're very careful, of generalizing away from the kind of fine-grained analysis that we need. It's true that the ground of all mental life is the planet Earth, but that doesn't really tell me very much. So however further out you go in analyzing cognition, you have to be aware that there's a compensatory cost in terms of the fine-grained detail that you're able to bring to an analysis of a given concept. I also just noted again that 4E cognition is actually not a super widely accepted view in the philosophy of mind. Many think it's false. That doesn't mean it's wrong. I am actually hugely sympathetic to the view, but philosophically speaking, I think we can allow ourselves to expand beyond this particular framework and look at some other philosophical resources that are a bit more historical, actually. So here's the second part. And forgive me, I'm going to take you into Kant's transcendental philosophy. For some of you, you'll be excited. For other of you, this is going to be heavy going. Kant is not fun to read. He's fun to understand, though. So Kant has this very important distinction between what he calls constitutive and regulative principles. I'm not going to read that quote because I reread it when I was rehearsing for this talk and realized the quote is like far too dense to be read aloud to anybody. So I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to give you a brief summary of the thought he's trying to express in this paragraph, which is basically that there are some principles that we use that allow us to intelligently interact with our world by looking at that world under the auspices of a question, where the world shows up for us because we interpret it through that principle as posing a problem for us that we need to solve. Regulative principles are like this. Regulative principles are those principles that show up for us and allow us to see the world as posing a question to us. Contrast that with constitutive principles, which are those principles that we use to interpret the reality of our experience, the world outside that we encounter, and those constitutive principles make the world seem a certain way. So they're descriptive. I'll unpack this for you in a minute. What I want to note is that Kant's transcendental philosophy here is very strongly related to a certain core feature of Buddhist philosophy. Both of these views think that the world out there, what Kant will call the world of phenomena, the phenomenal world, is In the Buddhist sense, the loke, the Buddhist world, loke, is what I'll call a correlative unity, structured by humans' forms of awareness, apperception, and feeling. What that means, in a nutshell, is that if your eyeballs were in your elbows, the world would look like a very different place to you. How the world seems to you is a function of how your perceptual and cognitive system is organized, because it is in virtue of that organization that the information you receive from your environment is integrated and interpreted. So here's a quote from the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon. It says that in the world, by which one is a perceiver of the world, a conceiver of the world, this is called the world of the noble one's discipline. And what is it in that world by which one is a perceiver of the world? The eye is that in the world by which one is a perceiver of the world. The ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, the mind. That is what is in the world in virtue of which one is a perceiver of the world, a conceiver of the world. So both Kant and the Buddhists believe that what the world is like is a function of how it's interpreted. Now we can start to apply this understanding. So a constitutive principle is something like, think of the concept of cause and effect, okay? We interpret our experience according to those concepts. And because of that, the regularity that we experience in nature manifests itself to us as causal. So constitutive principles constitute our experience. Because we use them to interpret regularity in our experience, that regularity is signified by us according to the content of those concepts. By contrast, regulative principles are those which provide for regularity in reasoning about what is given in experience, but the objects of regulative principles can never be found in experience. We need them to regulate our inquiry into experience because we're finite. So the main concepts here that Kant is worried about are concepts like God and the world as a whole. What I'm claiming is that we should think of Dharma, the concept of Dharma, and the concept of Buddhism as regulative principles, not constitutive principles. The concept of Buddhism, the concept of the Buddha's Dharma, are concepts that should regulate inquiry rather than inspire us to think that we have actually come to fully grasp descriptively the essence of that concept, which is what we're doing when we think of them as constitutive principles. So Kant's project is articulated as a response to a historical predicament that he sees between empiricists and rationalist epistemology. He sees empiricism as being basically leading inexorably to skepticism, and rationalism leading inexorably to dogmatism. And my point here is that Buddhist neuroapologetics and cultural critics both run the risk of becoming kind of Buddhist equivalents of dogmatists and skeptics. So the Buddhist neuroapologetic is kind of like a Kantian dogmatist. They think they're going to find the really real Buddha Dharma as it is in itself by hacking the brain with mindfulness. By contrast, cultural critics run the risk of becoming skeptics and that they deny there is any referent for singular Dharma or Buddhism. Everything about Buddhism becomes mediated, determined, and constituted by cultural contexts. And so we have only a kind of socio-culturally distributed, historically specific plurality of Buddhisms. Forgive me the Buddhist rhetoric here, but the middle path here is to recognize that both of these views are extreme. One is eternalistic and the other is nihilistic. The solution, I claim, is to think that the singular concept of the Buddha's Dharma is not a constitutive ideal that is falsely believed to be either empty or fully determined, depending on which side of this dialectic you're on. Instead, we should recognize that the Buddha Dharma is a regulative principle, not a constitutive one. Last part of my solution. It comes from Indian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, in particular the thought of the late Madhyamaka thinker Shantarakshita. And here's the first line of his very important treatise, the Madhyamaka Lamkara. He says, these entities, as asserted by our own Buddhist schools and other non-Buddhist schools, have no inherent nature at all, because in reality they have neither a singular nor manifold nature, like a reflected image. What's going on here? I'm going to reconstruct the argument for you. Here it is in standard form. So Here's what he's trying to tell you. If phenomena, whatever, any particular thing that might come under your rational lens for analysis, have an ultimate nature, the Sanskrit word here is svabhava, then it must be either fundamentally unitary or fundamentally manifold. Madhyamaka philosophy has batteries of arguments for why there are no fundamentally unitary entities. And I'm not going to walk you through them right now, but I'm simply going to point out that the kind of cultural criticism that I've outlined against the Buddhist neuro-apologetic view is a really good example of why you might think there are no fundamentally unitary entities. But if there are no fundamentally unitary entities, he reasons, then there are also no fundamentally manifold ones. Why? Because all manifolds are composed of parts which must be unitary such that their aggregation could constitute a manifold. Therefore, there are no fundamentally manifold entities, and therefore their phenomena do not have an ultimate nature. What does this have to do with anything? What is Shantarakshita talking about? Well, I think we're wrong to affirm the ultimate reality of one true Dharma that we excavate from history with the tools of science on the one hand, just as much as we are wrong to think that we can use the tools of cultural anthropology to determine the nature of all those different Buddhisms out there. Buddhism itself is neither one nor many. Its unity is something we must try to earn, knowing full well that the work is asymptotic. And here I quote Ibn Husserl, the founder of the phenomenological tradition of philosophy, who says, in this total society with its ideal orientation, philosophy itself retains the role of guide, which is its special infinite task. Interpreting these traditions is an infinite task. Final thought. I want to point out that my proposal here is actually quite resonant with our early Buddhist discourses on the nature of the final goal of Buddhism, nirvana, which claims that nirvana is something neither a multiply realizable mental state nor a singular realm or destination we go when we die. So also is the Buddhism or the Dharma we try to study as contemplative scientists, neither a universal law of nature, nor a purely local, culturally constructed, historically relative accretion of human activity. My conclusion, we need more philosophy. That's my conclusion. More philosophy is needed. Why? First, we need to undergird the proliferation of these operationalizations, practical applications of Buddhist practice, and we need to provide constraint on how cultural contexts are used as frames for evaluating the merits of these different applications. And that's it. Thank you. Just under 45 minutes. Lots of time for talking, I hope.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So the floor is open. Let me, because I think we had more people join us once you got started, Sean. So let me just go over briefly how we can proceed with the discussion, conversation period for the benefit of everyone, all the participants, or attendees is what Zoom webinar calls us. So everyone, at the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. So if you click on that icon, you'll see Q&A. So option 1 is to type into this box your comment or your question for Sean. Sean also sees this, and actually you should all have the ability to see the open Q&A box. So, typically what I do with Q&A is I read out loud, or the featured speaker can do so instead of me. I read aloud the questions, and then Sean will address the question as he sees fit. This is partially for ADA compliance. Okay, there is another option, and the other option is, instead of typing, you can speak your comment or your question. In order to make sure that everybody's comment or question gets attended to, I will ask that you raise hand. So at the bottom of your screen, you should have a raise hand icon. Once Sean and I see your hand raised, we'll call on your name. And then you have the capability of asking your question verbally out loud. By next to your name, you will see a couple of, okay, next to your name, you're going to see allow to talk. Okay, so raise your hand. Either Sean or I will call your name, and one of us will click allow to talk, and so you can speak directly to Sean. Okay, so there are two options: Q&A box or raise hand, and we'll click on allow to talk, and you can speak out loud your question or your comment.
I can't
So
see you.
yeah,
I'd rather hear from you. So do raise your hands if you feel comfortable. Here's Arindam.
great. Oh, okay. So Arindam, let me. I think you had, yes. So Arindam had his hand up first. Can you unmute yourself? Yes, thank you.
Am I audible now?
Can hear you
Yes.
perfectly.
I have two questions. Since it's my philosophy colleague speaking at International Cultural Studies, first is a philosophy question, second is a cultural studies question. First
Excellent.
question, you have rightly distanced yourself from those modern equals Western Buddhists who wish to make Buddhism a mind science. And of course, Dalai Lama and all have encouraged that by throwing away karma and rebirth. You have distanced yourself from them. But you seem to propose a cautious science friendliness, CSF for Buddhism. Now, my question is, how does CSF, this cautious science friendliness, handle the irreducible tension, incompatibility between scientific conception of mental causation, if any, under eliminativist or connectionist or even epiphenomenalist pictures of brain-mind relationship?
Yeah.
The tension between that and the frankly normative picture of karmic causation, which you have also hinted at. For example, laws like an akusala, a bad mental act, eventually causes a painful mind-body state. No modern Western neuroscience can make friends with such mental causation claims. Do you want to answer both the questions together, or do you want to answer them?
That's a huge question. So here's what I would say. First, my own personal view, cards on the table, is I'm agnostic about karma. I think that there's a lot going on in the weeds of karmic theory. And I think that one might endorse a view that says something like, what you do now is going to condition what happens to you in the future, and say, but I don't really have anything to say about what the future might look like after this body dies. So the tension that you're setting up between what we'll just call reductive analyses of mental causation on the one hand, and the robust normativity of full-blown karmic commitment on the other, I think that there is a lot of room between those two, right? I have no philosophical struggle with the idea that organisms are inherently purposive entities living in an enchanted world of thoroughgoing normativity. And that normativity can be cashed out in all kinds of ways, whether you want to do it conceptually in the way that someone like McDowell wants to do it, or whether we do it more on a biological level in terms of affordance theory and perception. I think that there is a lot of room for us in our understanding of the way the mind interfaces with nature to see the world as thoroughgoingly normatively charged, and remaining agnostic about the, you know, the sort of what I'll call full-blown karmic commitment of robust Buddhism. I have actually, my stated view on this is I have no idea about karma, you know, in that stronger sense of the term. So it wasn't my intention to claim that anybody, Buddhist modernists or otherwise, are correct in distancing themselves from karma and rebirth. For all I know, that's true. I don't have any deep view about that. That's outside my ken. But in terms of the dichotomy that you're articulating, I think that there's a lot of room for normativity and agency in the natural world that is probably a lot more robust than what the reductive views that you're talking about allow, and a lot more conservative than the kind of normativity that is embodied by top-heavy Buddhism.
Okay, we can talk about this later on. I just wanted to get a sense that since you are trying to bring them closer without reducing one to the other, I wanted to know about this normativity of causality problem. Do you want to infuse some genuine irreducible normativity into scientific causation pictures, or do you want to actually reinterpret the Buddhist frankly normative picture more scientifically as amoral at heart? Which way are you inclining? You don't have to have a final view.
The first one.
Okay, good. That's you know, I'm proud of you. Okay, second.
Neo-Aristotelianism all the way.
Good, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, second cultural question. I know that calling Buddhist philosophy scientific would not make it go up in prestige, become more rigorous or more rational than it already is. Then what is the point of trying to bring the political economic culture of science closer to the culture of Buddhist theory and practice, unless it is motivated by improving the marketing of Buddhist philosophy in the grant-seeking market? I mean, if with your papers we get some NSC, National Science Foundation grants, NSF grants, I'm welcome. I can welcome that. But otherwise, don't you think that contemplative science model of Buddhist philosophy and ethics harms the humanities, which alone, that is humanities alone, can welcome the compassion, empathy, meditative attention, self-criticism to subject and attention to subjective states, and nirvana-oriented moral psychology of Buddhism? I'm saying this because the times are such that it seems that all this worldwide spread of, taking away everything from humanities and philosophy and even literary studies becoming a new branch of science is actually, there is something sinister about that. That's my question.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer your question here, Arindam. I guess, for me, when I'm wearing my philosopher of mind cap, I do not feel that I am beholden to the sciences, right? I feel obligated to engage with neuroscience and psychology as a matter of disciplinary responsibility. And so the contribution of, it depends on how we diagnose the contribution of the humanities to this interdisciplinary milieu, but insofar as the task is to bring in philosophy of mind of some stripe, whether it be Buddhist philosophy of mind or even just straight modern philosophy of mind, that to do that well just requires engagement with science. That psychology, especially the psychology of attention and neuroscience of various stripes, for me, a lot effective neuroscience, that the data provided by these disciplines is just essential to being able to have a careful discussion at the conceptual level about the nature of mind. So that's just sort of a kind of boundary condition that I operate in when I'm trying to do this kind of work. I take the point that humanities as a whole right now suffers greatly from a crisis of relevance. But I believe that crisis of relevance is actually internal to the history of philosophy itself. you've taught Plato's Republic. You know that even there, Plato is profoundly self-aware about the way in which philosophical questions need to be actively engaged with in order to show up as relevant at all. And it's very easy to dismiss philosophy and by extension the humanities when one's attention is guided in certain ways. So I think the crisis of the humanities is a perennial crisis. I don't think it's a local specific one. I think it's one that has been internal to the articulation of the discipline since its inception, at least since the time of Plato. And that from an interdisciplinary perspective, I think what it means to do philosophy on the mind in a responsible way simply demands of us that we engage with the relevant empirical sciences. And the way to be careful about that in a way that respects the contribution of the humanities is my answer to your first question, which is precisely to recognize the thoroughgoing normativity and hermeneutical ensconcement that encases any scientific discourse. And when we keep that in mind, the relevance and centrality of humanities discourse to interdisciplinary work can never be erased or eradicated.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have two attendees who typed in their comments and their questions. So I would add, and they're longish. So in order to save time, and we won't read them out, but I would ask that everyone click on the Q&A icon so that you can also see the questions. So Sean, do you want to just take the first one?
Let me just look at it. Let me read it. It's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anand. I'm glad you came. It's good to see your name typed in a little box, even if I can't see your face. So here's your question. Anand's question is the following. I'm going to answer it live. Okay. So Anand says, thanks, Sean, very helpful talk. One question I have is simply a request to hear more about what you think makes a good partnership in a conversation with science. It seemed like you were thinking that only if the two traditions have similar enough principles in common can they be good partners. Is that what you're thinking? Can you say what are some features that make for a good partnership? Is it true that just because two traditions have a lot in common, they will make a good partnership? Can traditions that don't have a lot in common be in productive conversation because of how they provide oppositional points of view for constructive engagement? So no, that's not what I was thinking. I mentioned that overlap as an initial motivator for why Buddhism and science might start a dialogue in the first place, but I don't think it's a prerequisite. I think that the features that might make for a good partnership, that's a really open-ended question. I'm not sure. I mean, one thing I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that might be relevant here is the idea that, you know, both science and religion in general, not just Buddhism, have a descriptive and normative component to the stories they try to tell about the world, right? There's a descriptive component which is like, here's how things actually are. There's some appearance, but really underneath that appearance, there is some fundamental facts about the world that we need to be sensitive to. And when we are sensitive to those facts in the right way, there's a normative upshot. I think that kind of relationship between descriptive and normative analysis is a big part of what animates the coherence of various world narratives of different sorts. And being aware of how those two parts of any given narrative are operating is a good way to start evaluating the compatibility of different narratives with each other. Is it true that just because two traditions have a lot in common, they'll make a good partnership? Of course not. Lots of traditions that share certain features are not good at working together. So I think that even in the tradition of doing Buddhist philosophy, for example, there is a profound amount of infighting between the philologists and the philosophers. And as someone who's trying to publish in Buddhist philosophy, this is a terrifying tightrope to walk, where, oh, am I text critical and philologically rigorous enough for the philologists? Am I creative and imaginative and interesting and argumentative enough for the philosophers? And people who study Buddhism in religious studies and study Buddhism in philosophy, they're not that far apart. We're pretty darn close. So being that similar, there's still a real challenge to learn how to work together. So my answer to that part of your question is no. Can traditions that don't have a lot in common have a productive conversation? Absolutely they can. right? That's why having religious studies scholars and interdisciplinary conversations about religion and scientists is so helpful. One of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the talk is how divergent their explanatory norms are. That divergence creates opportunities for dynamic interaction, which drives a conversation forward. Okay, that's my answer to you. Okay, so second question, written question from an anonymous attendee. Anonymous attendee says, it seems to me that the problem of Buddhist modernism arguably stems from a more general problem of reducing Asian traditions to their representative schools of thought as they are articulated by non-Asian writers. Like Alan Watts with the Zen tradition and Taoism. Good. We don't have this problem the other way as far as I'm aware. We don't have a Chinese writer, for instance, reducing German philosophy to a kind of German philosophical modernism. We typically talk about Buddhist thought or Zen thought rather than the thought of particular Buddhist thinkers. But we don't seem to do the same thing with Western traditions. If I'm going to talk about the Christian tradition of philosophy, for instance, I'll go to Augustine or Aquinas. But for Buddhism, people are still discussing Buddhism through the lens of Western interpretations rather than through Nagarjuna or Dogen, for instance. Do you think this is a remnant of Euro-monopolism, Eurocentrism within the history of philosophy? Interesting question. I think it depends on where we couch the question. So from a professional point of view, I don't think so. Because my experience of doing Buddhist philosophy in the academy is that people are extremely careful to demarcate who they're talking about and when. And the difference between Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophical thinking and Vasubandhu's Abhidharmic philosophical thinking are about as far apart on the metaphysical map as it's possible to be. So I think that there might be a very general level at which this question has force, but I think in professional avenues, in professional environments where people are having academic discussions, that the fine-grained individuation of Buddhism and its different parts is very alive and well. You know, and in my own talk today, I was very careful to note the historical terrain, school orientation, and authorship of the two different Buddhist ideas that I mentioned. So I mentioned an extract from chapter 9 of Buddhaghosa's Visudimaga, and I also quoted the first verse of the Madhyamaka Lamkara by Shantarakshita, and I also quoted briefly a passage from the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon. So I think this idea that it really depends on where you're deploying it, but I think from a professional perspective, I'm not as worried about this as I might have been 50 years ago.
Thank you. Oh, okay. So, you know, we're getting close to 1:30. We do have a question in the Q&A box. So I hope everyone can see the questions now. I did turn on that function, but Sean, would you like to read this question?
Frank asks me how my views on meditation have changed over the past 12 months. I mean, I don't know if they've changed too much over the past 12 months. I mean, I will say one brief thing about it. I think that the reason Frank is asking me this question is because he knows that I've been a long-term practitioner of Vipassana meditation, which is where Frank and I originally met. And so I think he's definitely asking me, to say something about how my own personal practice of meditation is interfacing with my intellectual comportment in the context of this talk. I would say I talk less about it. My views on meditation is that I think a lot of the ways that people talk about meditation, either personally or professionally, are very idealistic. You know, the practice of meditation as it pertains to my personal life is very much just about kind of getting through the day and dealing with negative emotions that cause me to feel frustrated and exhausted a lot of the time. I think a lot of the discussion in professional circles and people who are meditators talking to each other, very idealistic, very much about, you know, these refined, absorbed states and altered states of consciousness. And for me, my thinking about meditation is very much just like, okay, just breathe, man. You got a long day, you know, and that's kind of like where I start and where I end with it. Intellectually, professionally, as as a professional philosopher thinking about the role of meditation in Buddhist philosophy. I de-emphasize it when I talk to my students about it because everyone is an expert on mindfulness these days, and I think it's dangerous. I don't teach this stuff to my students. So, you know, my thinking about meditation is that if it's something you're serious about, just get on with it. I'm grateful that a lot of the psychology on this is starting to engage more with some of the negative effects. Willoughby Brighton's work on this is, I think, really important for that reason. I could say more, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming to this talk. So, you know, we are, oh, okay. So there's somebody in chat. Okay, so somebody wrote something to you, Sean, in chat. So this, you know, we're going to send everyone a link. We do, you know, do some light editing in terms of putting in the questions to the video feed. Thanks everyone for showing up, and thank you, Sean.
My pleasure.
Terrific, invigorating talk. Yeah, so stay tuned for more talks in international cultural studies.
It was a pleasure, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Sean.